Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this CPD session, which is being run by Mary Donaldson and is on data management for scholarship and research. Hi, Mary.
Hello, thanks for having me along. So as I was just saying in the preamble, this presentation is one that's primarily aimed at researchers rather than scholars of teaching and learning. However, I've tweaked some of the content to make sure it's as relevant as possible. And if you feel that there's anything that really doesn't fit with your areas of practice, it would be really useful if you would let us know so that in the future we can refine our content further. Sometimes we're guessing a little when we go out to talk to people what's actually most relevant and most useful. So all feedback is welcome. So, see if I can make this work. Right. So I think the first thing I want to say is research data, data for scholarship and teaching and learning, data that underpins projects is any information, physical or digital, that you require to underpin the process by which you come to your outcomes. So not just underpin your research, but whatever outcomes or claims you want to make at the end of your project, you'll need data of some sort to underpin that as evidence. So we're not just talking about numbers. A lot of the time, we're talking about qualitative data, not quantitative data. It could be incredibly diverse. So a lot of numerical data does go into spreadsheets, but we also have examples of data that are actually recordings of dance, transcripts of interviews or focus sessions or reflective notes that researchers have made during their practice. And all of that could count. Okay. So why do we do research data management? There are benefits to the wider research community. So good data management promotes integrity and reproducibility for whatever we're doing. The better your data management is, the better you can evidence your processes. It facilitates sharing and reuse of that data. And whenever somebody's gone to the effort and expense and time to collect good data on a topic, then there's a good chance that that data might be useful to others. And the more it can be reused, the better value that the research community gets from data collection. And it can strengthen the scholarship environment because the better the integrity and the better you can evidence what you've done, the more people are likely to trust your findings. And if you're looking to influence practice, then you want to take people with you, and showing them how you got there is a really good thing. It's for any of you lucky enough to be funded to do your work. It's also a better use of that funding because the more data can be reused for one single lot of data collection, the better the value is to the funder. There are benefits to you as well. So it reduces your risk of data loss. And I don't just mean, whoops, deleted, I've lost all my data. But over time, data becomes functionally lost. So data, if you think back to data you collected 10 years ago, could you put your hands on it in a usable format today and actually be confident that you know what's in those files? And if you can't, that data is effectively lost to you. So may still be sitting there on a disk somewhere, but if you can't use it with confidence, then it's sort of functionally lost. The better annotated and managed your data is, the less chance, or the slower that process of functional loss is. It also creates the possibilities of new collaboration, because if your data is well annotated and it's available for reuse, not necessarily openly available, but available with maybe some provisos or licenses or things like that, people might want to work with you to reanalyze that data. They may have ideas for what can happen with it. And that can open up the possibilities of new collaborations in the future. And it makes it easier to write up your results because you can be certain when you open a specific file, you know what you're looking at. So again, this speaks slightly to that idea of functional loss. You need to know exactly what you're dealing with when you come to write up your findings. Okay. Now, I realise that this is not specifically relevant to scholarship of teaching and learning, but actually it's a really useful basic premise on which to go forward, in that publicly funded research data or research that occurs in publicly funded universities are a public good and they're produced in the public interest. So they should be made openly available with as few restrictions as possible in a timely fashion, but in a manner that doesn't harm your intellectual property. So if you've collected that data, if you've pursued that course of research or scholarship and you've put the work in, then you are entitled to benefit from that in the first instance. But what the government now says via UKRI, and actually it's wider than the government, it's a Europe-wide, it's an OECD-wide principle now, is that data doesn't belong to you specifically. It should be put out there for the most reuse possible and for the best, in the best interests of wider scholarship. Okay. So that's jumping from the big principles into the sort of nitty-gritty of what you should actually be doing. So when you think about, or when you're looking at a project, the first thing you should be doing is, after you've kind of conceived of what you'd like to do, write a data management plan. So, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that in a second. And then once you've written your data management plan, think really carefully about your project setup. So making sure that everything's actually in place at the start that lets you do the things with your project and with your data that you want to do later on down the line, because very often some of the decisions made at the start cannot be revisited. So you have to get that correct. On a really practical level, implement a good file naming strategy and folder structure, because that is one of the single most useful things you can do to capture some useful metadata and to help you keep track of what's what. Keep good documentation about your project. So in the dataverse, we call this metadata, so information about data. Metadata, the limits of metadata don't exist. It's endless. So it's thinking about what makes sense in the context of the work you're doing. And then when you come to write up a project or to publish your work, if you're going to do that, curate the data set that underpins that work. And when I say curate the data set, I don't just mean the data files. I mean the data files and all that metadata, the documentation that you've collected, and the README files that make sense of what are in different folders. Pull it all together as a package, because then you have a package of information that is related to a specific project. And it's easiest to do that when it's all fresh. And then if it's appropriate, deposit that data set in a repository primarily for long-term safekeeping, but also for sharing if that's appropriate. And then when you publish your work, use data citations to link that data set to the output that you've published. And encourage your peers to do the same. If you've got colleagues working in similar areas that maybe don't have access to research data support. So some universities restrict their research data support to researchers only or to staff only. You can spread the word. There's a lot of information about this available online, and it really should be something the whole community is thinking about. Okay. So data management plans are very short documents, and the simpler the project, the shorter the document. So anything from about probably a side of A4 to maybe 4 sides of A4 at the absolute most. And it sets out how the data arising from a project will be handled. And it's a structured document, so that you'll be posed a series of questions and you just answer each question in turn, working through it with the help of guidance available. So the university has its own templates for data management plans, but if you are funded by an external agency, they may have their own preferences for templates. All the templates that we have are available in this tool here, DMP Online. Glasgow has a site license for this, so it's freely available for all members of staff to use. The nice thing about using DMP Online is on each page, as you're being asked the questions, down the right-hand side of the page are links to guidance and support. that you might need in order to answer the question. So it's all kind of captured in a single tool. We've also put the templates into Enlighten. So if you prefer not to use an online tool, you can download the templates from Enlighten, download the associated guidance document and work from that. So this is just an example of the sorts of areas you may be asked to consider in a data management plan. So there will be a description of the data that you'll be collecting or creating, or if you're reusing data, which data sets you'll be accessing in order to for reanalysis purposes. You'll be asked if there's any standards or methodologies for data collection and management in the area that you're working in. People get worried about this one because they're not aware of anything in their area. That's because almost always the answer is no, because these things haven't developed yet. Some areas have wonderful standards and methodologies, for example, chemistry, but other areas have nothing at all. If you're not aware of anything in your area, the chances are it doesn't exist yet. But these things can't be imposed from the top down. They're sort of ground up standards that develop over time, and we're hoping as time goes on, different areas of research will develop their own methodologies and standards. You will be asked about any ethics or intellectual property concerns or restrictions regarding the work you're going to do and how you plan on addressing these. And you will also be asked about your plans for data sharing and access in the longer term. So this is after the project's ended, what will happen with that data, who will have access to it, and how that would happen. And I'll just say here that data sharing is not necessarily open access. It could be restricted access if that's more appropriate for the data type. It's also appropriate here if your data is just not suitable for sharing. You explain that in your data management plan with the reason why. And finally, you'll be asked for your strategy for long-term preservation of that data. Now, data needs to be readable for at least 10 years post-project. And born digital data is inherently fragile because storage media change, software for accessing media change, even file types change over time. So thinking about what file formats you're using, where you're storing your data, have you got backups, things like that. Can you guarantee that data will still be available in 10 years' time? Big hint here, if you give that data to a repository, that becomes their headache. So it's a really good reason for sticking stuff in a repository. So, and I want to look at the ethics, data protection, and sensitive data. So the second bullet point on my what do you actually need to do slide was take care with project setup. And this is what I'm really talking about here. So in addition to a data management plan, the other two things that are really important when you're doing research that involves human participants or data from human participants is data protection and ethical approval. And if you don't get these right at the start, ethics committees do not allow you to go back and reconsent your participants, typically. I don't know about the SOTL ethics committee. Sarah can maybe comment on this, but the other ethics committees at Glasgow will not give a researcher permission to go back to their participants just because they made a mistake at the start when it came to consent for data deposit or consent for data retention. So there is a workflow available in Enlighten. This is the link for it down here. And it takes you through the process of setting up and integrating data management, ethics, and data protection. And basically, so the three teams that are responsible for these areas developed this together. And we decided that starting off with a data management plan is the logical start point, because that's where you write out everything you want to be able to do with the data. So you illustrate the data that you're going to have and what you want to do with it. Then you move on to your DPIA and your privacy notices and cover the legal side to make sure that you're legally covered for the uses of that data that you want to make. If your research is taking place in the NHS, then the university has a team sitting in MVLS that will help advise with this. If not, you're straight to the DPIA. After you've got that in place, you can apply for ethical approval. Okay. When you're applying for ethical approval, make sure that you have included information about what will happen with the data in the short term and the long term. And if you are planning on making the data available for reuse, make sure you have the participants' consent for that and that they understand how that will happen. Sorry, I've just realised there's a whole load of writing here that I didn't need to guess about. So if your research requires ethical approval, you must have consent for data deposit. And that's just for retaining the data for the 10 years that the university requires. And this next one is really important. Don't get confused between, or don't conflate personal data and research data. So sometimes you need the personal data from a participant for the short term in order to, you might approach them a couple of times over the project and you need to know who's who. But that personal data can be disposed with at the end of the project, but the research data will be retained for the longer term. If that's the case, make that explicit in your participant information sheet and your consent form. Don't just say the data will be deleted on this date and the data will be retained, because your participant doesn't reasonably know which data you're talking about. And that's the single biggest reason why we have to refuse to take data sets in the repository, because there's been confusion in the ethics documentation about what's exactly going to happen, and we don't know what the participants have understood. So be really explicit about this. If you have a requirement to keep that personal data, so in some projects, personal data is the research data. If that's the case, that's fine. Just don't tell your participants you're going to destroy it. Make sure it's clear what's being retained. And don't promise de-identification or anonymization if it can't be achieved, or if it's not useful to your project. So tell your participants up front that the data will be kept for at least 10 years after the research and in an appropriate repository. And if you think it's going to be appropriate to share it, get their consent for data sharing. However, we are mindful that in some projects are so sensitive that participants are only likely to participate on the basis that data won't be retained or data won't be shared. If that's the case, that's okay, but that's an exceptional circumstance. Generally, it doesn't apply. And if that is the case, it needs to be explained in your data management plan. Once you're through ethics, you can use the information risk classification guidance that the university produces to determine the level of risk in the project. And then if it's a high risk project, the university's data protection team will want to see your DPIA. If it's not a high risk project, then that DPIA just gets filed into the university's data protection repository as evidence that you've actually completed the process. So that's kind of what I mean about good project setup. Make sure you've got all of these boxes ticked at the start so that you're covered towards the end. Okay. This is a slide my colleague Matt came up with to help people think about the data that they collect in a project versus the data that they share from a project. So the dark blue represents all the data that you produce in a project. So everything that you've got, dead ends, stuff that turned out not to be so useful, the really, really important things, all of it. And then you've got the data that are suitable for deposit. So this data set may have been cleaned. It may have had all the personally identifying information removed from it, if that's appropriate. It may have had pseudonyms added, things like that. And then you've got the data that are suitable for sharing. So that's the data that you've got consent for sharing. So when we're talking about data sharing, we're not talking about sharing everything. We're talking about sharing that core data set that's necessary for the reproduction of your conclusions, but which are also suitable for sharing with others. Okay. Now, in addition to that data, there's the other bits that I mentioned earlier, the bits that we need to curate. So there's documentation to accompany the data set. There's code or protocols or non-data resources that you can share from the project that might help people make sense of the data. And you may have also used some third-party data sets in your research. You may have combined those or reanalyzed those. You may not have permission to share those data sets directly, but you cite them so that others can then access them if they need to. Okay. So then moving on to file and folder organization, as I said, this is probably the single smallest thing that you can do that's useful in a project. So this is for small to medium-sized projects, not for massive data projects that probably have their own pipeline anyway. But establish a habit of the minute you have data, a working copy of it into a separate folder. So you have this original raw data that's had nothing done to it. It's not been cleaned. It's not been modified in any way. And the reason for that is when you're working on the working copy and something happens, you maybe try something and it's not actually what happens isn't what you'd intended, or you accidentally delete something, whatever, you've still got that raw copy to go back to and take another copy of. You've also got the opportunity to evidence what you've done. So if anyone queries any data manipulation that you may have carried out or any data cleaning, you can show them where you started if that's appropriate. Into these folders goes a README file that basically explains what is the data, how is the data acquired, what software is needed to open it, what the file naming convention is, and anything useful that people might need to know about the data. Now, I've got sample prep there as an example. I come from a biology background, so that would be useful, but it may be a copy of a protocol for a semi-structured interview, something like that. So what the sort of the cheat sheet that you were working from as you spoke to somebody. And then from that working copy, you can then process your data as necessary as you move towards a publication. And again, in each of these folders, there should always be a README file. Where's the data come from? So you can track the provenance of a data file as it moves through your system. How's the data been processed from that previous folder to this folder? What software is needed to open it? What's the file naming convention? Is there anything else useful? Now you can see from this that you'll end up with many copies of the same data files as they move towards a sort of more processed, more analysed version. That starts to give you an idea why we don't deposit everything in a project, because chances are it may be just the raw data or just the sort of final process data that you actually need to evidence what you've done. And all these steps in between are needed for provenance, but you don't need them once you're kind of beyond the end of the project. So that's something to think about when going through selection and appraisal. So I also mentioned sort of documentation that you might need, the metadata that you gather around the data. And the best way to think about this is what information you might need yourself. If somebody asked you in 5 years' time to go back to this project and find a specific bit of data to evidence something, what would you need to make sense of the data that you've collected? So again, the ideas here are limitless. It could be the details of the sample preparation or where samples were collected. It could be your experimental protocol or your project protocol. It could be inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria for participants in your project. It could be, what do the field names mean on your spreadsheets? Did you label your columns? It could be details of the software that you used at the time because things have moved on, or it could be as simple as a list of abbreviations that you used because abbreviations pop up with different meanings at different points in your career. So the possibilities here are endless. They're specific to your research. And as I said, the best thing to do is think about what you might need coming back to this project when you've been working on something else for a while. And yeah, the idea is trying to get things out of your brain and into format that doesn't require you to remember what you did. Okay. So I now want to talk about storing live data. This is not something our team has responsibility for, but I think it's something that's maybe not talked about very often in the university. So I've included this here just as a contrast to the next section where I talk about what you do with the data after the project. So live data is data that's still being used, collected, analysed. It's the data while your project's actually running. And there are several options for what you do with this within the university. So the university has network drives available. They're your J drive, your H drive, I think some schools have P drives, but it's basically your university network storage. Then there are storage available in Teams and in OneDrive. So this is SharePoint Microsoft storage that's contracted to the university. And the university also has something called Nextcloud, which is cloud-based storage where the servers physically sit in Glasgow. So it's a sort of halfway house between true cloud storage and an on-site solution. And these different systems offer different functions. So all of them allow you to restrict data to a small group of people. And all of them allow you to share data with your colleagues at Glasgow. However, if you're working at a collaboration across universities, our local network storage is not going to be suitable because the IT people do not like giving people external to the university logins to our J drives. That just doesn't happen unless there's a very good reason. However, Nextcloud is good for this, and even better, Teams and OneDrive don't just provide storage that you can share with collaborators, but you can actually work on the data in those systems directly if you're using fairly standard tools. In Nextcloud, you would have to download the data, work on it, and upload it again. And again, Nextcloud allows you to share data with collaborators that don't have a university login. Teams and OneDrive may also as well, but not all universities have Microsoft contracts. So not all your collaborators may have Microsoft logins, and if they don't, they won't be able to get into these systems, in which case Nextcloud is provided as the solution to this. What we ask that you don't use is Box, Google Drives, iCloud, anything that's not contracted to the university. There's really good functionality in these, but you've got no control over where the servers are, so you could be shifting data outside of Europe without really thinking about it. And it's also not clear, especially for services where the servers sit in America, who owns that data. The minute you've uploaded to those systems, it's not clear who owns the data anymore and what the redress is if that data is lost. So don't put research data there. It is okay to use these systems to put organizational information. You know, if you're organizing a collaborative project across lots of different places, your meeting notes could go there, your sort of protocols, things like that can go there, but not research data, and certainly not research data that comes from human participants because it's not appropriate. Okay. Okay. So, moving on to the next step in the sort of data management pathway is curating your data. So when you've finished your research, whether you're going to publish it or whether you're not going to publish it, try and draw together the relevant documentation for the project, the data that underpins the project or each figure, if it's a publication, a README file, which at the very least lists all the files that you have, explains the file types, folder structure, and file naming conventions. As I said, it's easier to have a README file in each folder, but you should have one at the top level with a sort of overview of the project. Once you've got this packaged data set ready, you can deposit it in a suitable repository and cite the data set in a publication or however. Another thing to think about when you're packaging it up is if you've got data that's suitable for sharing and metadata that's suitable for sharing and other data that's not suitable for sharing, put them in separate folders and mark them clearly in the headers, because it makes it very easy to see which data has to be kept more securely, dark, as it were, from data that can be shared. Okay. This asterisk at the bottom indicates the actual data that goes into this package. For example, raw versus processed, de-identified versus identifiable will really depend on your research. As I showed you with that Venn diagram earlier, it very rarely involves all the data that you have. There requires a bit of sort of selection and appraisal to work out what's really necessary. And that helps bring the size down as well. So there are lots of long-term data storage options. So these are for once you're finished your project and you've done your analysis and you're keeping the data for the long-term retention period. The university has Enlighten Research Data, which is a data repository. We've also got EdShare at Glasgow, which is an educational resources repository. Glasgow has a presence now on the OER Commons, which is the Open Educational Resource Commons repository, which may be a useful place to look at. Then there are things like Figshare and Zenodo, which are just generic repositories that can take all sorts of different kinds of data. If you're using a collaborative project and you don't want the data to sit in one university's repository or another, you kind of want it to be a bit more sort of independent of a single institution, then looking at these generic repositories can be really helpful. Re3 Data up here is a registry of research data repositories, and they have this really nice search tool. So you start at the middle and you click on the area that your research relates to, and then you work your way out, becoming more and more specific until it actually gives you a list of repositories that are available in your field. So that's kind of a nice tool to see what's out there. Okay, this is just an example of a record in Enlighten Research Data. Records in EdShare are similar but not quite the same. They're built on essentially the same software, but they've been tweaked, obviously, for different types of content. But in Enlighten Research Data, we have the title of a data set. We have a list of all the creators. We have a link to the publication that the data underpins. We have a DOI for the data set itself. This means that the data can be cited independently of the publication that it's supporting, which means if it's reused in the future, the data set itself can collect citations. We have some data files and we have some documentation files that are available. If your data wasn't to be openly available, you wouldn't see any data files here. There would be a button that says click to request access, and then we would go through whichever process was appropriate to determine whether access would be allowed. But even when that's the case, documentation can still be freely readable. So you can put up some documentation so people can decide if the data set's going to be useful to them before they request access. And just for example, this is an example of data being cited in an article. So this was the article. The data were put into the Dryad digital repository, and they've included the DOI of the data set. So anyone reading the article can click straight through and look at what's available to underpin it. Okay. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of good data management. As I said, it's mostly from a research perspective, but I think a lot of it could be appropriate or could be applicable to scholarship of teaching and learning. Our team can provide a lot of help on this. And as I said, we do not discriminate based on what your role in the university is. If anybody wants to come and talk to us about data management, we'd be delighted to hear from you. So we can provide grant application, advice and support if you are applying for funding for a project. We can review data management plans as part of that, and we can advise on costing RDM activity if you've got a funder that's willing to pay for RDM activities. We run Enlighten Research Data, which is the university's data repository. And in addition to being a sharing platform, it's a safe data storage platform for the long term. So even if your data is not at all shareable, it's still good to have it in Enlighten for that 10 years. Because as I said, it takes the responsibility out of your hands for the digital preservation actions that might need to occur. And when you deposit data in Enlighten, you put a retention date on it, which might be the 10 years that you told your participants. When that date's up, we will carry out the retention action, which might be to contact you and say, do you need this for longer? Or it might be to delete it, but it means it won't be forgotten about. A regular problem at the moment is participants are told that their data will be deleted after 5 years, but it's not followed through because people forget that the data's there. We also provide advice and training. We've got loads of information on our web pages. The training that we've got available for staff is a middle course on the Introduction to Research Data Management, which is what I've spoken about today, but in much greater detail. We've also got a new course available just this year, which we'd love people to take a look at and give us some guidance on. And it's specifically advice on working with sensitive data. So it's intended for people who are working with human data from human participants, with a lot more detail about how you're meant to handle and think about that. That's also available on Moodle. And we've got a webinar on writing a data management plan with DMP Online. Now, data management plans are very intuitive, very self-explanatory, but for anyone that prefers to have a bit of support doing it, then this webinar is quite useful. And then we have training available for students if you know anybody that's interested. And we also provide bespoke training. So we are happy to come out and talk to any group of staff or students in the university about any specific aspect of RDM that they might like a bit more information about in detail, or just give a general introduction with a few more examples on a specific topic. So links to all our training can be found on our web pages. But really, the most important thing is if you've got a question, just ask us. We don't expect you to trawl through all the web pages before you come and ask us a question. Just give us a shout. Okay.
Thank you. That was fabulous. I think I will now stop the recording, and then if anybody wants to take the mic and ask questions, they can.